You have to have visionaries, you have to have people that will think outside of the norm.
We're getting access to viewpoints and to people and to connection that we never, ever would have.
We have to believe change is possible in order to bring it about.
Having integrity in yourself and in your work, that is success.
We are our own leaders. We all are responsible for the change that we want to see.
It's about a broader question of representation, who gets to define how we see the world.
It's the power of sharing and connecting and vulnerability.
How do we intentionally rebuild a sense of community?
Every single person around the world can create a movement.
Please welcome Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, Candace Montgomery.
Welcome, everyone. I wore my green for you. As they mentioned, I'm Candace Montgomery, Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, the team that brings the Atlantic's journalism to life on stages and virtually across the country. We are thrilled to partner with Michigan State University for tonight's event. American democracy is at a crossroads. The looming threat of authoritarianism, global unrest, and the related crises of disinformation and misinformation pose an existential threat to our future. As we enter an election cycle unlike anything we've ever witnessed, younger generations are wrestling with the tension between deep political polarization and finding solutions to the issues they're most passionate about. So where do we go from here? Since 1857, the Atlantic's journalism has operated under the founders' most cherished beliefs, that the free exchange of ideas across ideological lines is essential to the great American experiment. Tonight, in partnership with Michigan State University, we'll unpack crucial issues shaping the 2024 election, including the social impact and integrity of this election and the role of journalism and technology during these unprecedented times. A few housekeeping notes. Please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We want you to be a part of the conversation. Please tag us in your posts and use #AtlanticDemocracy. Now, please join me in welcoming Interim Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Michigan State University, Thomas Yaichko.
Thank you, Candace. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Michigan State University, including Michigan Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist II. Indeed, thank you. Esteemed alumni panelists, yet to come, MSU students, faculty, and staff, and members of the broader community. Welcome all. Civil discourse plays a crucial role in any democracy, and it plays an even more important role at times like these, when many urgent issues are at the forefront and influencing the election cycle. Universities and other institutions of higher education play a unique role in society and possess unique potential to model informed, robust, and civil conversations around tough issues. To encourage and to help guide civil discourse here at MSU, we have worked hard to assemble and provide timely and practical resources for our students, our faculty, and our staff. At its very heart, at its very core, higher education is characterized by the lively exchange of ideas. Universities are places of inquiry, of innovation, and of discovery. They are driven by curiosity and by courage, both of which are essential if we are to broaden our perspectives and expand our knowledge. Michigan State University prides itself on being a place that tackles tough questions and explores challenging issues. We do so to learn more, to make a positive difference in local and global communities, and to advance the greater good. Many thanks to The Atlantic for bringing this opportunity for dialogue to our campus. It is rewarding to see so many of our academic units and students engaging in discussions around key issues and the election. It is also rewarding to have esteemed alums join us during our homecoming week to both share and demonstrate the value and the importance of journalism in today's democracy. Thank you for your participation in today's event and for your broader engagement in our participatory democracy. With that, I'm happy to turn it over for the start of session 1, and thank you again.
Here to discuss abolishing voter apathy, please welcome Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist II with Sarah Alvarez, Editor-in-Chief of Outlier Media.
Hey, hello. It's nice to be here with you.
Good to see you.
And it's nice to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for coming and participating in this conversation. And I know that a lot of you all are interested in journalism and in local news, so we're going to see how that happens in real time, right? I want to start out actually by questioning the premise of this discussion. The prompt was, how do we abolish voter apathy? And I have kind of a long wind-up for this question, so bear with me. But, you know, first I think that we have some numbers that definitely point to voter apathy not being as much of a concern, right? So in Michigan, in 2020, the state had the highest youth turnout in the country. That definitely, hey, all right, give yourselves a hand. You know, that does not point towards apathy. We just did a survey with Detroiters, and we talked to 1,100 of them. And this was when Joe Biden was running, and his unfavorables were very high, and still 70% of the people that we talked to said they were planning on voting. Again, that does not signal apathy to me. But I also do live in the world, like I feel the discontent that people have. We did talk to, in that same survey, the Latino folks that we talked to said that they were not thinking about voting because they didn't feel like it makes a difference. And when we asked people about local elections, they said that they didn't feel like local officials cared about what they wanted done, and so they weren't planning on voting in the local election. And we see that in voter turnout, right? Voter turnout in local elections, especially in Detroit, is extremely low. So we have this, and I also think we see, especially in the presidential election, people really voting not from a place of apathy, but from a place of like deep emotion, right? Fear or grievance or something like that. So I think what I really want to hear you think about is like, what could make the relationship between voters and officials more productive?
So I appreciate that question a great deal. For those who don't know, I am actually an engineer by training. I'm a software developer. I've built companies that solve problems for people. And I start with that because I don't think it's coincidental that some of the people who have the least confidence in voting or the least confidence in the government are people who either have been failed by that government or people for whom, when they needed something from the government, they had to go through an excruciating and sometimes humiliating process to get it. And so I think that like apathy and frustration can sometimes be conflated. Those don't have anything to do with engagement. So the answer to your question, or at least how we get in the direction, is how can we focus on making systems work better for people? How can we focus on solving the challenges that people face? If people say that their rent is too high, well, let's figure out a way to like lower people's rent, or to put money in people's pockets so they can deal with the expenses that they have. And I think having a more sort of practical and responsive approach that is grounded in listening and relationship. I mean, there's a reason why I spend so much time on the road or in community, listening to people and understanding what their priorities are, and then building an agenda around that versus going and talking at them with an agenda. Because of course, no one's gonna feel like you're responding to them if you're coming with all mouth and no ears. And so I think this is what can help to change the relationship with public officials, but also the experience of government, period. That if we believe that good government has a role to play to give people access to a dream of health and wealth, then good government has to actually listen to people.
You know what, I was actually going to ask you about this because, you know, we really see the information landscape be so fractured, and just because there's the internet does not mean that people can access the kind of information they need to meet their challenges or to achieve their goals. And it's really difficult, I think, to put together an information diet for yourself that's pretty healthy. I think that that challenge as a elected official might be even more difficult when you have very loud, very powerful, very well-supported voices who really want to access you. What does your information diet look like? How do you try to make sure that you really are hearing from constituents and that you are understanding needs of constituents, because now you're in statewide office, who may not have voted for you but who depend on you?
Yeah, so this is grounded in again, the sort of the arc of my own experience. So I told you, I started my career as a software developer. I was at Microsoft out in Seattle for 4 years building SharePoint. If you ever used SharePoint and you liked it, that was all me. But but actually, I quit my good job at Microsoft to go become a community organizer, and actually worked on campaigns for social, economic, and racial justice and voting rights across the country. And during my training to become a community organizer, I learned a profound truth that sticks with me even as a public servant. And it's that you don't need to tell people how to solve their problems. Like, the people who are dealing with a challenge and experience it, that they're closest to that challenge, they are the ones who are intimately familiar with what the solution looks like. And so my information diet is grounded in how many conversations I can have with these people on a given day. Like, yes, I read the news. I actually read tech news before I read political news. Don't tell anybody. But those conversations, and then so the diet is working with my team to make sure I'm having enough conversations with a broad enough set of people, you know, and on a daily or weekly basis. And so that's why, like, you know, my schedule's ridiculous. Like, I started, like, so on Saturday, I was in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. For those who know what the Upper Peninsula of Michigan looks like, Sault Ste. Marie's really far from here, right? But I was in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan in the morning, and then I went from Sault Ste. Marie to Traverse City, Michigan in the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula. Then I went and stopped off in Flint, went to Detroit, went to Monroe, then went to Pontiac, all in the same day. Mm-hmm. That's a very wide cross-section of the state of Michigan. But that's important because I need to have a very wide aperture in order to try to gain some understanding. And so for me, the information diet is people.
Mm-hmm. And that, you know, we hear a lot about the polarization of the country, and that is real. But if you are going all around the state, how do you find people's willingness, who maybe did not vote for you and are not planning on voting for a Democratic administration, how do you find their willingness to engage with you?
So people have to, it's an interesting, like, seeing a person who looks like me and is my size in certain parts of Michigan.
It's not a common experience.
It's not. But What that has meant, though, is it actually has garnered an openness, like, oh, well, damn, like, he came up here. Like, forgetting that my responsibility is literally to all 10 million people in Michigan. Like, there's no place in Michigan that I'm not accountable to. But I think there is still a genuine surprise sometimes, even almost 6 years into public service, that he came here and spent this time. So I try to leverage that. So when I'll go to communities and I'll have small, like, off-the-record conversations, no cameras, no microphones, 10 people, tell me what's important to you, tell me what success looks like for you, tell me what you're anxious about. And I get a really wide range of perspectives, because I think some people come like, yeah, I didn't vote for, Whitmer Gilchrist, but like, he was crazy enough to actually ask me what I think. And so I think that in order to be an effective public servant, you do have to be audacious enough to ask the question. And it's why it's so important. And you can't really be good at this job if you're afraid of people.
Right.
And that means you can't be afraid of people who don't believe that they disagree with you. Now, I frame it that way because, I can find something that we can talk about. Whether we can argue about Michigan and Michigan State or something, like, I can find something we can talk about. And my job is to work hard to create that space for a person to be willing to tell me something that they disagree with me on. That's my whole job.
And really, it is the job of all of us, and something that we all seem to have fallen out of practice with, and especially after the pandemic, especially after we were separated from each other for a long time. Do you find that people are getting back into practice? Do you feel like people are getting better at getting connected, or do you find it as difficult as it always was? It doesn't seem like it's that hard for you.
Fair
In
enough.
Detroit, by the way, even the engineers have statewide elected official levels of charisma.
I think I do think that people have sort of returned to what their personality was before. If you were someone who was extroverted pre-COVID, I think by now you're probably an extrovert again, if you ever stopped. But if you were introverted, that may still be, your personality. I think the way to think about it is you have to think, like, whose responsibility is it in an engagement to make sure everybody feels like they can show up as who they are. And I think it's the responsibility of those who have, convened it. If I convene a space for us to talk and you can't talk, then I fail, not you. And what I need out of the interaction is a better understanding of life in Michigan, so that I can say, oh, you know what? As a retired person who is on a fixed income and dealing with rising prices of prescription drugs and groceries or school supplies, and I hear about that again and again and again in community after community after community, including like from my father, who, look, he called me every single day and told me how much money was coming out of his pension check.
Good for him.
For his tax. Yeah, he was a hell of an advocate. But that advocacy from him personally, but from retirees across Michigan, is what led us to repeal a tax on retirement income that had been in place for 13 years, because, people who live on fixed income should have all of the money that they were promised in their career, not having that money taken from their check to give tax breaks to rich people in big companies. And so, we wouldn't have known the primacy of that issue without talking to people. So it's important.
And, let's go back to your background as an engineer, right? And you said it yourself, that means that you're a systems person, right? There are so many ways to impact a system when you talk about something like cost of living, there's so many different ways that you can be of service and create change. Why did you choose government after doing other things like being an organizer and working in the corporate world?
Yeah, so the way I would define engineering is really not about, something technical. It's making systems work for people. And I define government in the same way. It's a system or a set of systems that works when it works for people. And when I was, so my wife and I, when I was an organizer, I was based in Washington, D.C. And so my wife and I, we moved home 10 years ago. And when coming home, you know, I'm a two-time recovering entrepreneur also, right? So I started a couple businesses, and I had an idea for another one that turned out to be a bad idea because, raise your hand if you're an entrepreneur and you ever try to start a business. Okay, well, that means you had at least one good idea and a lot of bad ideas, right? So I had a bad idea. But when I thought about what I wanted to do coming home, I really thought, man, I want to do something that touches as many people as possible. And so I thought that, look, I worked at Microsoft, one of the biggest companies in the world, but every single person on the planet is not a Microsoft customer. I worked for an organization called MoveOn.org as their national campaign director. It's the biggest progressive advocacy organization in the country. They had like 8 million members when I was there. But no organization has everyone as a member or constituent. The thing that touches everybody, if it's working right and working well, is the government. So if I wanted to have impact at scale, in this case at city scale, because I was interested in working in the city of Detroit, then the place to touch everybody from and to get it to work best and to help rebuild the trust in the institution was to work in the government. So that's why I chose the public sector, and then that extended now to my service to the whole state of Michigan. I like solving problems and working with people and identifying the ones that, there might be a solution and maybe there's some technology we can sprinkle on it that can help unlock potential for people.
Mm-hmm. And, there are a lot of issues that could be worked on. There's a lot to do in government. And, there are a lot of people who are, of course, motivated by wanting things to be better. But I think we also have to be honest when we think about the role of, discontent in motivating. And I think the question about discontent is, how is it productive? When can it be productive?
So there is always a place for agitation. I learned that as a community organizer. There's always a place to say that and to challenge a system or a person to be better and to do better.
Well, let's follow up on that because, here we are at a college campus and we have seen a lot of protests across campuses, last year, this year. And I think that many of those have been treated as if they are, protest is supposed to be disruptive, obviously, and they've been treated as disruptive and not productive. What do you think, and you being in government, what do you think your responsibility is to kind of engage with that discontent and that kind of energy, which sometimes can come from people who are just upset, but also can come from people who really want things to be better?
Yeah, and I come to that with both hats. So again, the hat of someone who, when observing a problem, wants to do something about it, and the hat of respecting and understanding that there is a place for people to say, I want something different or new or better. Both of those things can be true, and part of what we need to get better at is holding more than one idea in our head and recognizing that both of those things can exist in tension with one another. From my perspective, protest does not bother me. Again, I think it's important, literally every modicum of progress we've made in American history has come as the result of agitation. But I think there is a way to protest that is strategic and that recognizes that who or what you're protesting, can they actually give you the thing that you want, which isn't always true in some protests or with some sets of demands. And certainly we've seen that progress in America through nonviolent action be ultimately what was the most victorious and effective versus people choosing violence, which I would never choose. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be mindful of that. But I think that, again, it goes back to me problem solving. So, for example, we have seen a generation of people who have really voiced in a new way a lack of acceptance for our criminal justice system. Our criminal legal system has failed people all across the country, certainly in Michigan. I led a jail reform task force in 2019, the most comprehensive of its kind in our state's history, because we couldn't answer questions like how many people in Michigan are in jail, why, and for how long. Very basic questions that we couldn't answer. But as a result of that work, we figured out that, wow, half of the people in Michigan who were in jail were there because of something related to a suspended driver's license and a fine. Well, why are we taking people's driver's licenses for things that have nothing to do with how they drive? Recognizing that if you can't drive, you can't get to work to pay the fine. And so we actually looked at it and really reclassified and took away the ability to take away people's driver's licenses so often for things that don't have anything to do with that, and literally sending people home from jail. Now, one of the other things that we observed in that is obviously the barrier to employment and economic opportunity and possibility that having a criminal record can pose when there's discrimination against people who have criminal records. Well, now Michigan, I led an effort called Clean Slate that has the most progressive, expansive, and inclusive automatic criminal record clearance program in the country. That'll make 1 million people job eligible in the next 10 years. When we lit up this program that says that if you have committed an eligible offense and then you finish whatever serving your time, it's been 5 years and you haven't reoffended, that goes away from your record rather than having to hire a lawyer and pay money and wait for the justice that the law says is yours. And at a time when we know businesses need to hire, they want skilled employees, we have a whole crop of talented, hungry, and ambitious people who have paid their debt to society. Let's let them reintegrate fully into civic and economic life and do that automatically. And I think that also has the benefit of having the government play a role in removing a barrier and solving a problem and dealing with a real frustration, which is like, I want to work, but I can't. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example of the kind of problem solving that I think helps.
And, that's a good, go for it. That's a good example of an issue that, access to transportation. We just did a big investigation on the inequity of car insurance charges in Detroit. That's obviously, there was car insurance reform passed in 2019, but it has failed to deliver for Detroiters. When there is an issue that people, and it might not be car insurance for most people, that may just be me. But
mine is expensive.
I can't even, later. Let me not get sidetracked. The average price, the average price of car insurance in the city of Detroit is $5,300 a year. That exactly. And it is not because of crime. It is just because it's too expensive. So if you're passionate about an issue like car insurance, say, or a variety of other issues, you have been able to be effective as an official on some of these things, right? And then there's blocks to things like auto insurance reform for residents. Given that you've been at city government, you've been an organizer, you've been in state government, what is your advice for how people can be effective on the issues that they care about? How do you find where you can create some change?
Well, the starting point is I implore people to be engaged. I'll talk about what that means, but yeah. I want to really encourage people to try. And I know that might sound like, earnest or naive, but
you're in government.
But like nothing, right. But like nothing, zero things in history have changed or gotten better by people not doing something or not saying something. And sometimes even in the midst of frustration, people, when they give up, and it sucks to fight for something for a really long time and not make progress. But all the fights that we have won have been long fights. I mean, the vice president said this actually in an interview she gave with Charlemagne and God in Detroit earlier this week when she said that, it took us a long time to get voting rights. It took a really long time to get the 13th and 14th Amendment. It took the 15th Amendment. It took a really long time to make progress. So the first thing is to remain steadfast in trying to get toward the solution. The second thing I'd say is when I got trained as an organizer, we spent a lot of time in making sure that the people we worked with understood the system that they were agitating against, and meaning understood the levers of change and power and where they were and how it worked. That's really important because to take you behind the curtain a little bit, like as a public servant, if I am agreeing to have a meeting with a group of people, it's because like I want to hear them and I probably want to figure out a way to say yes to them. So in order for that so then I need to be met halfway with something I can say yes to. Mm-hmm. You know, so like you can't come to me at the state level and ask me to fix a federal problem, right, for example. And so it's worth, because you care, because the thing is so problematic for you, because it's limiting your economic opportunity. It is preventing your grandma from getting you know, better when she's sick, whatever it might be. Like, it's worth doing that. And I know that's a lot of work because we tired and we overworked and we stressed out, and I get that. Mm-hmm. But it's also that burden that you carry is what gives you the credibility to be the better messenger on it than anybody else. Mm-hmm. So we need that.
I have two more quick questions before we run out of time. One is, how do you try, you know, it's easy to show up it's not easy, but it's getting easier to show up at election time. And this is just a continuation of that last question. How do you want people to show up between election cycles, and how do you try to show up between election cycles? You know,
for me, it's that when I talked about having these conversations in every community that I go to off the record, whether that's with, you know, a set of elders or like, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, for example, I hosted a roundtable with high school students on gun violence. You know, so there were no cameras there, but I wanted to understand, like, so on a basic level, like, how often do you think about gun violence?
Mm-hmm. What'd they say?
As a kid, like all the time.
Yeah, constantly.
And like, so what does that mean for you? And so I think that for me, it is, I think people trust what they see consistently. And so my job, my responsibility, it's my job to make sure that I am doing the work to get an audience with you. That's my job. Mm-hmm. And so that is not an electoral exercise. It may have electoral benefit, but it is not an electoral exercise. Now, yes, the level of activity often increases as you get closer to election day. That's because humans like deadlines. Like, I mean, that's fine. But to me, and what I've tried to do in my service is to say, like, I do care what you think on November 6th. Because on November 6th, you're still a Michigander, I'm still a Michigander. We still have work to do, we still have problems to solve. Nothing gets fixed in one day.
Right.
And so my job is to be that consistent and to show up and to try to continue to put points on the board and tell you the points that I'm trying to put on the board and get feedback on that.
And then my last question is, what do you want to do next? Because you have to figure that out. There's a lot of offices in this state. There's local offices, there's statewide offices. What do you want to do next?
There are a lot of offices. You know.
Do you want to run for city clerk again?
Oh my gosh, no, I don't. That I can answer fully and completely. I do not want to be the election administrator in the city of Detroit. The reason why I'm going to answer the question this way is because I didn't move home to Michigan 10 years ago to run for office. I moved home to raise my twins and now my third child in the city that I grew up in. I moved home to try to be useful to the place that made me who I am. And this public service thing, like, literally came out of nowhere. Like, I got convinced to run to be a local election administrator, which I lost, and that losing is not great. Governor Whitmer called me in a way that I had no anticipation for to serve the state of Michigan, and I expected my wife to tell me that it's crazy that that lady calls you. You should say no to her, and she did not say that. And so I've learned a tremendous amount in that. And while right now, I think the environment that I make that next decision in is really, really going to be impacted by what happens between now and November 5th. We can have there are many scenarios where the world looks very different, and understanding how to show up in that world is grounded upon what we do to try to shape that world today. So I am like, I'm not even being like kind of coy, like I am like super focused on that. But I think that the opportunity to continue in public service is a privilege, not a right. And people could be asking me like, "Hey, Garlin, when are you gonna get out of our faces? Like, I need you to go somewhere else and do something else and never hear from you again." And it's really humbling that people aren't saying that. So I'm looking forward to figuring that out.
Yeah, well, you started this conversation talking about being responsive. You are now ending this conversation talking about being responsive. So very consistent. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. That's all the time we have.
Thank you.
For a conversation on the pending future of American democracy, please welcome The Atlantic's Tim Alberta, Elaine Godfrey, and Jemele Hill. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic contributor Evan Smith.
Good afternoon. Great to be here. Great to be with all of you, Jemele, Elaine, and Tim. I can't start without noting that two of the people on stage with me are alums of this university.
Go Green!
Go Green! Elaine, we're just going to have to accept that our status today is lesser than them, right?
Go Clones!
Is that going to be controversial in this audience?
No. It's a Big 12 school. Nobody cares.
You all, we're going to talk for a while, and then with about 15 minutes left, we're going to open the floor for questions from all of you. So think up some good ones. But we're going to try to cover all the important stuff, beginning with the premise of our event today. The premise is that democracy is at a crossroads. Really? Can we pressure test that? I mean, I know we say that all the time, Jemele, but is democracy really at a crossroads? Is the outcome of this election really going to determine the future of democracy?
Well, I would even take it a step further. It's not just democracy being at a crossroads. I think the soul of this nation is what we're fighting for in this moment. This is our opportunity to decide what kind of nation that we want to be. And frankly, I think because of the political tone, the discourse, what we have allowed, when we think about, when most of us or some of us were growing up, the things that were considered disqualifying for a politician to say and do and act and behave, those things are completely out the window.
We shrug our shoulders at things that just a couple of years ago we would have thought disqualifying.
Man, somewhere Howard Dean is crying a silent tear thinking he got eliminated for yelling too loud.
For screaming.
For screaming excitedly. That's what used to, do it. And while I do think there are certainly examples where we were probably a little too stringent, a little too on our little high horses when it came to politicians, I think we've gone so far in the other direction that an overcorrection is necessary. So when you think about this election from that standpoint, it's not just about the democracy, because I think that's a big part of it, because a lot of the guardrails that were there are not there before. When you look at generally, I know being a journalist and being a member of the press was never, that was always going to be a profession that came with a certain amount of disdain for it. Like, we all know that when we accepted this mission to be journalists. But it's so bad now that to the point where I think that people don't really realize that part of what make democracy work is a free press. Right? Like, they don't even make that relationship with it anymore. Social media has just changed everything with how people view us. So to wrap up, what I would say is that, yes, I think we're going to be fighting for old things that we thought we'd settled. We see that now. And I think democracy is one of them. So I don't think it's being dramatic. I don't think it's being alarmist. I think it's very true that democracy is on the ballot as well as our entire souls.
Tim, let me come at this. I like Jemele's answer a lot, but I want to come at this a different way. When we talk about democracy, that sounds like an East Coast media construct. When we talk about democracy, do we define the word the same way on the coasts as we do in rooms like this one? Do you think everybody means the same thing when they say democracy or democracy's on the ballot?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think, at least maybe for the sake of my own conversations that I have, Evan, I like to think of this more in terms of democratic institutions, right? And when we think about the danger posed to democratic institutions, institutions that are sort of essential to a self-governing society, we think about, obviously, institutional decline in America around confidence in the press, around confidence in the church, around confidence in college football, for crying out loud, the financial system, the healthcare system, everything else, right? But I think the real threat here is to our most fundamental institution, which is the ballot box. And the idea that every 4 years, when you have a presidential race, that the two teams fight hard, and they might even fight a little bit dirty, but at the end of the day, there's a winner and there's a loser, and the loser concedes defeat, and they go back to the drawing board, they try to win again the next time, and we carry on like that. And there is a peaceful transfer of power. That is a sort of core democratic norm, and I think the democratic institutions that are sort of set up around preserving that norm have very much been under assault over the past 4 years. And so when you try to have these conversations, I have noticed, Evan, that I think to the point you're maybe getting at, look, if I am in a room full of conservative Trump supporters, and there is a sort of a vague, even potentially emotional appeal to democracy, you get eye rolls and you get sort of scoffs and people who aren't necessarily going to take you seriously. But if you walk through the tale of the 2020 election in Michigan and the shenanigans that went on with everything from the most powerful state lawmakers in Lansing being pressured by the President of the United States and his attorneys to do things that were illegal and unconstitutional, to the State Board of Canvassers, where it ultimately fell on one young man, Aaron Van Langveld, this young attorney for the Republican caucus in Lansing, who was one of the canvassers, and there's only 4 of them. There's 2 Democrats, there's 2 Republicans. We can talk about the flaws of this system on a different panel. But effectively, if they had deadlocked, if at least one of these Republicans wasn't willing to certify the statewide results, then it would have been thrown to the Supreme Court. It would have been unprecedented. It would have caused a lot of turmoil, to say the least. And this one young Republican had to stand up in that meeting and say, I'm sorry, but what happened to a nation of laws and not of men? And there's nothing here, there's no proof. So no, I'm not going to side with these other Republicans. Yes, I am going to certify this election because that is my job as a caretaker in this democratic institution. And then he goes into hiding for a couple of months because of all the death threats. So right. Our institutions are only as strong as our people, right? The institutions are people, and what we've seen, I think, is an attack on the people themselves and on the institutions. And I think to the degree that we have an erosion of those democratic institutions, that's what we're all here concerned about.
Elaine, I'm going to give you the hard or the easy job, depending upon how you look at it. Having established with Jemele and Tim that democracy is indeed on the ballot, and what we mean by that, who is responsible? Who is the threat? Often at moments like this, we hear, well, both sides really are coming. No. Let's be honest about this. Speak the truth. Who or what is the threat to democracy?
Yeah, this is not a both sides thing, I'm sorry to say. I'm not sorry to say, I guess. I think that's pretty good that it's not both sides. And I was just talking about this with them backstage. I just wrote a piece about the disinformation swirling around during Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene. That disinformation was coming from one side and one person, namely Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, accusing Democrats of sending the hurricane to Republican areas. And this stuff would be maybe funny if it wasn't so serious. The traction that those lies got on social media and that big accounts shared, it was insane.
Well, there was a push notification yesterday on my phone. I had to read it 3 times to believe that I was seeing it, that said FEMA folks had to stop going door to door because of threats against them as a consequence of the misinformation that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, FEMA was saying, please stop lying. It's preventing us from saving people's lives. And it's making these local officials have to, respond to lies instead of sending out water bottles or whatever. Like, it's a real issue. It's coming from one side. Point being, I think that, and the point of the piece I wrote was, November will be worse, right? Like, if this election is close, which it probably will be, if Donald Trump wins, which he might, if he loses, which he might, we're going to hear a lot of this stuff, probably if he wins too. But I just think it's coming from one side. I think distrust in public officials has never been higher. I think it's warranted in a lot of these cases, right? Like, I think a lot of people aren't used to their congresswoman saying Democrats are sending hurricanes at you. This is a totally new era for us.
And you wrote in this piece, false claims have real world implications, and I could point to FEMA, but I could go back several weeks and I could point to Springfield, Ohio, right? Where false claims about Springfield, Ohio resulted in schools having to close, people under threats of assault, and an entire community that did nothing but come to this country looking for opportunity to take jobs that other people wouldn't take. Suddenly now that community is put in literally the crosshairs as a consequence of misinformation that is admitted to, acknowledged by those spreading it.
I was there. I went to Springfield.
Right.
I went to this, quote unquote town hall hosted by Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm sure you saw it. It was not a town hall. It was only Trump supporters there. It was a Trump rally. It was people getting together to spread more disinformation about Haitians in this community. There were no Haitians there, speaking their truth about what was going on. And people told me there, well, to echo J.D. Vance, they said, even if they're not stealing geese out of the park and eating them, it's a problem, and we're glad the press is here to talk about it. Like, the lies were worth it, basically, to get people talking about this problem. We're going to keep seeing that, I guess, is sort of the purpose of my reporting lately, is that is going to keep coming.
Right. So the torrent of misinformation is one of the things Jemele referred to effectively. She didn't use this phrase, but the new abnormal, right? The obliteration of norms, things that now happen that we shrug our shoulders at, where once upon a time we would have thought this is the most extraordinary thing. Tim, you've been the kind of Trump whisperer within the universe of the Atlantic, in the sense that you've written extensively and pretty amazingly about the inside of the campaign and the movement. The overt nods to authoritarianism, I say, would be another thing that just a little while ago we would be shocked by, but now not so much.
Yeah, there's a passage in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah where he's describing the sort of moral, civilizational decay of Israel, where he says they have forgotten how to blush. And that's kind of what comes to mind here, Evan, that we have become so desensitized to all of this that when the former president refers to people who don't vote for him as the enemy within, we say, what's next? What's on the next news cycle? And
we're calling out saying specifically, maybe we need to bring in the military to take care of these people.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and look, some of what I had reported earlier in the year that maybe you're alluding to, Evan, is that even some of the high command of the Trump campaign, these are individuals who, starting with his co-manager, Chris LaCivita, is a guy who I wrote extensively about in my first piece this summer, where Chris was a guy who joined the campaign, and within the first few weeks of him being on the campaign, Trump had sent out this social media blast toying with the idea of terminating the Constitution. Now, Chris is a Marine vet who earned a Purple Heart in Desert Storm and who has friends buried at Arlington Cemetery, and was deeply, deeply bothered by this and confronted Trump, in fact, over it. And yet, he and so many others on the campaign sort of choose to ultimately accommodate themselves to this sort of rhetoric and to say, well, he doesn't really mean it. This is just, his style. He's sort of blowing off steam. He says these things, right? Look at what he does. Look at who he surrounds himself with. Don't look at his social media. I think the obvious problem with that, well, there are a whole host of problems with it, but one of the immediate problems that comes to mind, Evan, is that we all watched for 4 years during the first Trump administration as many of the sort of A-team, the professionals surrounding him in the West Wing, on Capitol Hill, at the Pentagon, elsewhere, sort of really tried to box him in.
These were the guardrails that we were told.
These were the guardrails.
Would protect us from his worst instincts.
That's right. And I mean, I can remember sitting across from Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, in his hometown of Janesville, Wisconsin, at 10 in the morning, the week after he retired from Congress. He'd already grown a beard and he was cracking a beer at 10 a.m., just to give you an idea of how this was going for him. And I remember him looking at me and saying, like leaning across the table, like, Tim, like, if you think it was bad, imagine if people like us weren't there, right? And at the time, I think a lot of us sort of rolled our eyes at that. I think if he wins, we're going to get a look at what it's like in that alternate reality of what happens if Trump is surrounded by sycophants and yes men and people who do not discourage his worst instincts, but actively encourage and enable them.
So, Jemele, I talked about overt authoritarianism with Tim. I want to talk about overt racism with you. You know, we know that there's racism in this country systemically, and there has been for some time. I wouldn't say it's so much the quiet part out loud as there's been a permission structure put in place to say things that just a couple of years ago we would not believe people would be willing to say. That is a major component of the threat, is it not?
No, that's a huge part of it, is that I've said this before about, Donald Trump, is that part of the way that he's able to intoxicate people is not just about, it's not necessarily presenting policy, he's presenting them things to vote against and not necessarily to vote for. And by vote against, I mean particular groups of people, things, because everybody, I think, has, maybe I won't say everybody, but there are particular buttons that he knows how to push that will make people respond to him favorably and ignore all these other things that we brought up. For example, clearly he has been able to weaponize the idea of trans athletes in a way that has been very helpful for his campaign.
And that's trickled down to almost every Senate race
Correct.
in the country. There are ads on in every single state about that.
Yes, and I noticed that a lot of these ads are running during college football. It's like the one about Kamala Harris supposedly supporting transitions, of inmates and the government paying for them. Like, that's running nonstop during college football. I was like, oh my gosh, we interrupt this Georgia-Alabama game for this. And so being able to constantly press those buttons, and I was amazed when I was in Detroit, maybe like last month, I think it was, listening to WJLB, which is the main #1 black radio station in Detroit, the ads running constant about how immigrants were taking black people's jobs, all sponsored by the Trump campaign, like constantly. So even in conversations that I've had with black people who I would think would know a little bit better, the immigration issue, that's the issue he's using. It's always a group of people he's using to sort of suck everybody into this racism vortex. So even if you think you're a person that is like, oh no, I'm against racism, but if he finds something that is a weakness in your armor, like, let's say that you are a working class, black person who is in line for, or at least some of these jobs that you see immigrants taking, then that's going to appeal to you, even though you don't consider yourself that. So the part that is really kind of sickening about it, and to frankly, even the way that the media has largely covered it, is continuing to lie and act like the racism is just a bug and not the feature. It is the feature. And so
he's running a design play here.
Yes, he is. Like, this is not some kind of sneak attack. This is very much a part of what his entire aura and how he's able to get people drawn into sort of his vortex.
Yeah. Elaine, let me give you a one that's a little bit more mundane, and that is the normalizing of incivility. The name-calling, the disrespect, the bullying that's become a feature of all of our politics. This is also something that, I think, let's not clutch our pearls about this, like people are mean to each other and people are incivil during political campaigns. This is not the first time that's ever happened. But we do seem to be at a different place as far as that goes. When I read in the paper that the former president said out loud with a straight face, Kamala Harris is retarded. When have we ever heard in a presidential campaign something like that? I mean, we've had in civil before, but not like that.
Yeah, like, can you imagine, like, Barack Obama, all caps, tweeting, I hate Taylor Swift? Like, that's more ridiculous, I guess, than anything. But, and it's so interesting because I've covered, 100 Trump events at this point in my life, and they're really nice to me. And you go up to these people, and in person, for the most part, they treat you kindly. And it's really frustrating because they're interpersonally nice, and then you start asking them about Joe Biden, and they start saying these horrible things and swearing and saying, he's really been dead for 7 years and it's a body double. And you're like, you're just a nice old lady. Like, there's just this weird, there's just this weirdness that has taken hold. And I think also, it again, not to use permission structure too many times, but it's given people a permission structure. The Trump era has given people a chance to sort of say what they never could say before, to say what they're thinking. I mean, people say, still to this day, I like Trump because he says what I'm thinking, right? Like, that is just what they still say about it, is the one consistent thing people say about Trump.
But it's not just permission to say it, but it's permission to say it without consequences.
Exactly. Yes,
right.
There's no more blushing involved. Right. Saying it, everyone just accepts that they say it. And I think, but I still think there are Democrats are still not operating that way for the most part. It is a weird double standard that Democrats hold themselves to, and also, frankly, that the media holds them to. It's hard to be a reporter right now because you see Trump say something like Kamala Harris is retarded, and I still have to write about Kamala Harris's finer points of policy, right? And it's really hard to fairly cover those things because Trump and his ilk are just such different animals in this way.
Tim, let me pivot from this and ask you about the polls. Why are the polls so bad? Why are the polls so inconsistent? What happened to polling? Who broke polling?
Oh, gee, Evan. Thanks for that. Who broke polling? So, okay, a couple of things are going on here at once, right? Donald Trump, give him credit for one thing, certainly, which is sort of tapping into an unengaged piece of the electorate and I think bringing into the fold a lot of people for whom politics was an afterthought at best, or in many cases, just something that they had given no thought to whatsoever, right? So these folks, the sort of hidden Trump voters, if you will, were really playing a big role both in 2016 and in 2018. And then I think what we saw in 2020 was an attempt to adjust the modeling, to modulate a little bit to try to account for more of these folks, and they still didn't get it quite right. So then, fast forward to 2022, you had a lot of pollsters who had now been burned 3 times and said, okay, we're not getting burned again, and then they really overcorrected. And so there was all of this bedwetting inside the Democratic Party leading up to the midterms in 22 that they were going to get wiped out, that there was going to be this red wave, and of course it didn't materialize. Republicans really underperformed. They lost a bunch of races they should have won. And actually, if you look back at the modeling, it's because they skewed too far in the other direction. Yeah. So that is the hope now, of course, that a lot of Democrats are clinging to, saying, well, we saw this in 2022, and if the same modeling holds for where Harris is now, then she's going to win, which is true. However, it's also true that in 2022, Trump wasn't on the ballot. And if we've learned one thing here over the past 8 years, pretty conclusively, it's that Trumpism does not work without Trump, right? All of these copycats, all of these low-rent would-be, imitators, the aspiring heirs to the MAGA throne, none of them can perform. Trump is going to wind up running 8 or 9 points ahead of Kari Lake in Arizona, which is astonishing in this political environment, right? So there's something sui generis about the man, and I I think that is why we sort of pump the brakes looking at not just any specific polls, but even at the averages of polls. Because I've talked to pollsters, some of the best pollsters in the country over the last year, they're not even sure about the numbers that they're getting back. And these are people who are very good at what they do. They know how to wait. They've spent a lifetime sort of perfecting this. There's not a high degree of confidence in what anybody's doing right now. So I think it's just a sort of blanket caution that we should all be taking.
So as Ezra Klein wrote in the New York Times the other day, ignore the polls between now and Election Day. That's the way to stay sane.
That's right.
Right? The only poll that's going to matter, as the cliche goes, is the one on Election Day. Jemele, let me ask you about the media before we go to the audience. Not the Atlantic, because of course the Atlantic is perfect.
1,000%.
But the other media kind of suck. Don't you think?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Who broke the media? I mean, when did the media start doing such a bad job of covering politics and campaigns? They seem completely unable to get out of their own way.
I'm going to say something that will probably sound strange, especially considering that I cover the sports and the intersection with race, gender, culture, and politics for the Atlantic. The reason that the media sucks now in political coverage is because they started to cover it like sports.
Is that right?
That is right. And by that, I mean, they're covering this like it's a game. They're covering this like
winners and losers.
Like there's winners and losers.
Players are celebrities.
Correct. They're covering this like they're covering betting odds. And like that's not the way you should cover politics, because these have real life consequences for people. You know, as you just talked about with the misinformation and the hurricanes, like people literally, their lives are on the line, and you're covering this like you're trying to see, like, oh, should Nick Sirianni be still be the coach of the Philadelphia Eagles? You can't cover politics that way. And so that was one big part of it. And obviously, I mean, we can certainly go into other factors in terms of the complete eradication of local news. I think that has very much hurt. Local news being wiped out has then left this on the behest of the national news coverage. And it's almost like from 2016, they learned absolutely nothing. After all of those sort of think tanks and all of that diatribe of like, no, we failed here. They weren't covering Donald Trump like a serious presidential candidate, and they still aren't. So they didn't learn anything.
Yeah. I love, Elaine, last thing here, Jemele comparing this to sports. Molly Jong Fast, the progressive commentator this week, tweeted that the problem with the media is they're covering the odds and not the stakes, right? And that we should remember that really what this is about is the stakes. She's right, right?
She's totally right. I mean, I think you maybe could be forgiven in 2016 for not knowing how to cover Trump. He was new. He was weird. He still is weird. For not knowing as a reporter how to do it. I think we've gotten a lot of experience. That was a long time ago. You got to be straight with people about who's telling the truth. I mean, for me, this is an election about like truth and lies. Like there's a clear answer here in terms of who is being straight with people all the time. And I just think as reporters, like we got to put everything in context. We got to call out the lies. Like those two things have to go together.
Good. All right. Let's use the remaining time to bring the audience in. We do not have a microphone to pass. We will ask you to put your hand up. I will call on as many of you as I could see, and we'll ask you to use your outside voice, as your parents said. And we'll save just a moment at the end for one last quick question to our panelists. Sir in the back, and then we'll come right up here front. Yes. I said, sir, I'm seeing this gentleman, young man right here with glasses, right there. Yes, sir, right there. Yes. I'm sorry. I think this is going well so far. What do you think? Yeah, it's going great. Okay, well, I mean, great. Yes, you'll be next, I promise. Great, yes.
Faith like that when their faith is lies.
Yeah. Can one of you solve this problem, please?
I mean, I don't know. Number one, I wish I did. I would start a think tank or something. I don't know. I have asked a lot of disinformation experts this question. The answer is media literacy. For a lot of people, like promoting media literacy, knowing when you see something on social media that's just a total fabrication. But I think the other thing, and I think this is something that like everyone can do, we can all do, if you're on social media, if you're watching cable news, I mean, those are the two kind of spots, but social media obviously is the worst culprit here in terms of seeing fake stuff. If you read something and it sparks an emotional reaction in you, think again about it, see where it's coming from, verify it, because so much of this stuff is designed to make you afraid, or make you sad or scared or whatever, emotional in some way. And like conspiracy mongering is fear mongering, and so you just have to figure out a way to like check the source. During the pandemic, my mom, who's she doesn't like Donald Trump, she doesn't like misinformation, but she has a really hard time telling if something is a lie on the internet. She wasn't born using the internet, and so we talked a lot about that, and I feel like I gave her a lot of like a mini lesson on how to like know if something is designed to make you afraid and is a lie. And I just think like having conversations with people you love in your life, or reminding them that like what this stuff is intended to do is really good. And just share it. Like try not to be a scold about it because nobody likes that. But I just think have conversations. The trusted source method is the best way to go.
Okay, my friend who spoke up and said, "I'm next." Okay, go.
Tim, I'm going to bring this more local. I didn't know you were going to be here. I would review your article for the Atlantic a couple of years ago. It was very touching, very loving, and you were very upset about MSU and all the shit that has gone on here. And so my question to you is, has your attitude improved? And that's, I really would like to know how you feel, and if so, why do you feel better or worse in this thing?
Forgive me, I'm not entirely clear what the question is. Better or worse about what?
Are you happier or more unhappy with where MSU is over all the stuff that you were upset about in the article?
You're referring to Michigan State University, MSU.
So the only, I'm wondering if there's a mix-up. I wrote an article after the shooting here a couple of years ago, but I believe from the context clues I'm picking up that maybe you're talking about Paul Nassar, and yeah, that's not something I've really written about. You could be confusing me with someone else. I don't know. I, for one, continue to not feel great about it. For anyone wondering, but I don't have much more to say on it, Evan. I have not written extensively on the sexual abuse cover-ups and all of the sort of institutional...
I was trying to think if I did, maybe.
Like, I was like, did I write about it?
Did you? Good. All right, let's try to take one from this side, right there on the end. Ma'am.
So Ms. Hill touched on the subject of racism and how Trump leans in towards those extreme views. There has been a decrease in tolerance from citizens in America, and so what is to say if Trump were to lose the presidency, that the Republicans and conservatives don't nominate the same person with extreme views or maybe even more extreme values as Trump that poses as a threat to democracy? Because he has already polarized the country so much that if Trump loses this election, it may anger his supporters even more to push another extreme candidate out for the next race.
I mean, this is always the question, what happens if he loses? Is everything suddenly magically back to normal? Probably not, right?
No, I mean, I think they've just seen the value in it, but I do think there's something to what you said, Tim, is that Trumpism doesn't quite work the same without him being kind of the leader of it. That's not, I don't want people to be under the false impression that if he loses, racism is going to disappear, or the kind of campaigns he was able to run playing off of that racism will suddenly become outdated. I think they may find someone who's just nicer about it, who maybe believes in the same principles but possesses a level of decorum that isn't so off-putting to most people. So I think you have to watch for that. But I don't like to give him so much credit to pretend as if the things he evoked didn't exist. They were there, and they have been there. It's just that he was able to make people feel more unapologetic about it. And so maybe, and that's why as Evan asked us this first question, that is why we're fighting for the soul of this country. That's exactly why, is that I think a strong message has to be sent that certain things are just not acceptable. Yes, we can disagree about politics, we can argue, we can debate about the best course forward, and I look forward to those discussions. But we have to have a level of integrity as we do that, and that integrity is missing. And so that, to me, is what is also on the ballot in a few weeks, or right now, since this early voting already started.
Yep. Evan, can I just add something to that?
You may, please.
Okay, so I want to be the turd in the punch bowl for a minute, if that's okay. Because I think that what's maybe lost in looking at the Trump era is that it does take two to tango. There's been a lot of ink spilled very recently on Trump potentially performing at historic levels with black voters, particularly with black men, even more particularly with young black men, which, by the way, is going to, that's like the tallest building in Topeka, right? Like the Republican Party has never performed well with these voters. So yes, if they perform even marginally better, then that will make history.
It's a low curb they've stepped over.
That's right. Yeah. But I think what's maybe worth emphasizing is that I've spent a lot of time reporting for the last 5 or 6 years on the drift of Latino voters away from the Democratic Party. And I've also spent a lot of time looking at the drift of working class white men and their sort of complete abandonment of the Democratic Party. And I think that there's sort of a through line here, which is to say that a lot of these folks, they are not wearing MAGA hats. They are not putting Trump signs in their yard. What I have found with extensive reporting in South Florida, in the Rio Grande Valley, across the Southwest, what I found in working class communities with a lot of these longtime blue dog Democratic voters who have now sworn off the Democratic parties forever, is a lot of them actually don't love Trump. A lot of them think that Trump is a bad person. They think that Trump is a racist. They think that Trump is a xenophobe. They don't like him. And yet, they feel like the Democratic Party doesn't like them. And they have become sort of so deeply disillusioned with and alienated from the Democratic Party that they have, for reasons that maybe they don't even entirely understand in certain instances, entered into this sort of uneasy alliance with Donald Trump and with the sort of MAGA movement. And I think that if you talk to most Democratic elected officials in this country, at least the ones who are honest, and if you sit down with them and if you look at the polling numbers that they have, if you talk to the people who are on the ground in their communities doing the organizing work, they will tell you that they have a serious problem on their hands. That the Democratic Party has, in many ways, sort of culturally, socially, economically, has become estranged from the working class in this country, and not just the white working class. When you see the exit polling in a few weeks come out, you are going to see some staggering numbers among, again, we're not just talking about your sort of white working class communities in Lapeer. We're talking about more ethnically, more racially diverse working class areas in this country that are abandoning the Democratic Party in droves.
And that's on the Democratic Party.
That's exactly right. So I think that we can sit up here and talk about Trump and all of his evils, and Lord knows I've spilled more ink on this than just about anybody. But I think that there has to be a recognition that Trump did not just manifest, as the kids like to say, out of thin air. That Trump was, in some sense, a response to something, which was both parties having turned their back on huge the forgotten men and women of the electorate, and they have taken it out disproportionately on the Democratic Party. And I think until Democrats sort of reckon with that, you're going to have the door open for more of the demagogues in the Trump mold who can sort of enter that vacuum and continue to pit people against each other.
I think it's a critical point. So,
well, I was just saying, can I just say quickly, to quote Wes Moore, because I think what you guys have both said is accurate, but I think he kind of really summed it up, is that Trump is the perfect vessel for the frustration. He's just not the solution. Like he makes the frustration feel good, but he gives you nothing to actually address the frustration.
So the clock is down to 0. I wanted to go over here. I can't, but I am going to take the privilege of the moderator and just say quickly before we go, if the election were held today, who's going to win?
Donald Trump.
If the election were held today, who's going to win?
Kamala Harris.
I think Trump will win.
But there's 3 weeks left. There's a lot of game left, as they say.
2016, Donald Trump wins by 77,744 votes in 3 states combined in the Electoral College. 2020, Joe Biden wins by 42,910 votes combined across 3 states in the Electoral College. So we are dealing like margins of the margins here.
Right, hair's breadth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as I told you backstage, it's not Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. It's Kamala Harris versus the couch. That's her competition.
Versus the couch.
It's all about turnout. If turnout is like Detroit in the last election, 49% of Detroit voted. For that number can't be that, right? It has to be high 50s, 60s in order to have a different outcome. I just don't know how people feel in terms of creating that turnout effect that should be there.
And I think the numbers that we've gotten so far, just today and yesterday from states in Georgia, for example, that's a good sign for Democrats. I think the early right. turnout has been very high.
You'd think the couch is losing, but we don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
We're only going to know on election night. All right. Let me say on behalf of my colleagues at The Atlantic, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for staying connected to what's happening and why it matters. Would you give Jemele, Elaine, and Tim a big hand, please? And looking back over your shoulders, Sarah Alvarez and the Lieutenant Governor. If you don't know, all Michigan State University students have been given free access to The Atlantic as part of our time here. Visit theatlantic.com/college to start reading today. Share your thoughts about this event with us by completing our post-event survey. Helps us plan future events to campuses like this one. I just want to give a special thanks again to our partner, Michigan State University. Give them a big hand. You guys get home safely. 3 weeks left. Good night. We'll see you again.
Go White.
I woke up to the morning sky.